Good morning to all once again. We gather now to talk about the transoceanic connectivity across the Indian Ocean region. Let me call upon Ms. Aishwarya Devasthali to open the session with her welcome and introduction. Aishwarya Devasthali is an archaeologist by profession, having interests in history, culture, tourism, and arts. She has completed Masters in Ancient Indian History, Culture, and Archaeology from Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute, Pune, in 2017. After post graduation, for 2 years, she has worked in the Archaeological Survey of India, a premier organization for the archaeological research and protection of the cultural heritage of the nation as an archaeologist. Currently, she is associated with Maritime History Society as a project research associate. Aishwarya, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Greetings to one and all. I'm Ms. Aishwarya Devasthali, Project Research Associate at Maritime History Society, and it's my privilege today to be here as the coordinator of session number 3 of National Maritime Heritage Conclave titled as Transnational Connectivity Across the Indian Ocean Region. Indian Ocean region has been a rich archive of history with its trade networks stretching back thousands of years, powered by monsoon winds. Reversing direction in different seasons, these winds have long shaped the rhythm of life around the ocean, bringing rains to farmers, filling the sails of dhows, and enabling trade between different ecological zones. This monsoon wind pattern makes Indian Ocean relatively easy to cross both ways, and that's why Indian Ocean is the world's long-distance transoceanic trading arena. And if we call India as the cradle of civilization, can we call cradle of globalization into the Indian Ocean region? So, to understand this in greater detail, I would like to proceed further to our session. I would like to introduce our moderator. So, Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam, ma'am, is the moderator of the session, and she is currently Professor of History in BIT Pilani, Goa. She has long, she has had a long distinguished teaching and research career. She has authored several books on Indian Ocean. These include The Sovereign and the Pirate, Ordering Maritime Subjects on India's Western Littoral, then The Sea Merchants of Bombay, The Medieval Seafarers of India, and many more. To understand about our panelists as well, I would like to introduce our first panelist, and he is Commodore Ajay Agarwal. He was commissioned into Executive Branch of Indian Navy in January 1988. He has specialized in navigation and direction. His important operational tenures include commissioning of INS Stefan as navigation officer and command of iron ships Cuddalore, Sukanya and Brahmaputra, and instructional tenures include divisional officer, National Defence Academy, directing staff at Defence Services Staff College, Wellington, and directing staff Higher Command Wing, Army War College, MOP. As staff, he has served as Ops Officer to K25, Joint Director Naval Training in ISQ, MOD Navy, and Director Net Assessment. His academic pursuits include graduation from JNU, post-graduation in Defence and Strategic Studies from Madras University, and MPhil from Mumbai University in same subject. He is pursuing PhD from Mumbai University through Naval War College, Goa. He is carrying out the duties of GM INCS since 29 May 2019. Our second panelist is an alumnus of National Defence Academy, Khadakwasla, Commodore Sanjay Dikuna sir. So Commodore Sanjay Dikuna BSM was commissioned into Navy on 1st July 1991. He is a specialist in communications and electronic warfare, having finished at the top of the Long Sea course. The officer is the postgraduate in Defence and Strategic Studies from DSSC Wellington and NWC Goa. He has also undergone electromagnetic spectrum management course from the Keesler AFB, USA, and the SSTR course from APCSS Hawaii, USA. Commodore D. Kuna has served on various ships and staff appointments across the Indian Navy. His previous appointment was as Commanding Officer INS Manduri. His previous and Station Commander North Goa, where he was awarded VSN. He is presently the officer in charge of Communication and Network Center in Mumbai. The officer is currently pursuing his PhD in Defense and Strategic Studies from Mumbai University. So I would like to invite Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam ma'am for sharing her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
I look forward to this session. There are three very interesting papers that are going to be speaking about a variety of issues. So I'm really looking forward to the observations that all of you are going to make, and maybe at the end of it, I will connect the three papers, raise a few issues about connectivity and maritime regions, and then allow it for further questions and answers. Thank you very much, Aishwarya. Also, let me take the occasion to thank the organizers, particularly Commodore Johnson, whose energy never fails to impress me, for having put up such a good show with remarkable efficiency. So thank you again, and I look forward to listening to all the papers. Thank you.
Can we start with our first panelist, Commodore Ajay Agarwal?
Thank you, MHS, for giving me this opportunity to share my views on the subject that I am passionate about, the Indian dhows. My talk will attempt to trace the history of maritime connections between the Gulf of Kutch and the Persian Gulf since Indus Valley civilization to the modern times. In that, primarily the role played by the Indian dhows will be highlighted. The main focus will be the modern trends in Salaya region related to dhows and the seafaring communities of the Gulf of Kutch. Let's first look at the geography. Western Indian Ocean has a unique geography wherein it has two major water bodies on either ends, that is the Gulf of Kutch and the Persian Gulf. Another interesting aspect of the geography is the major rivers that drain in these water bodies. Whilst the Tigris-Euphrates river system drains in Persian Gulf, the mighty Indus drains in the sea adjoining the Gulf of Kutch. The two regions are connected by land through Makran Coast, which was known as Gedrosia in ancient times. Once the monsoon wind pattern was identified, it facilitated seaward movement of goods between the West Asia and the west coast of India using the northwest monsoon in summer and the southeast wind pattern in winters. The two river system that I mentioned earlier acted as a highway to facilitate quicker and safer movement of men and material from hinterland to the sea coast by using river navigation techniques. It needs to be visualized that in the absence of a developed road network in that era, which was fraught with several man-made and natural risks en route, the rivers became an unhindered and fastest means to provide access to the areas deep inside the heartland from the coast and vice versa. Having seen the geographical aspects of maritime connectivity, let me very briefly touch upon history. Some of it has already been mentioned by Dr. Vasant Shinde yesterday in his opening remarks. Archaeological evidence suggests that Indus Valley civilization had a flourishing trade with Mesopotamia and Rome. In the Middle East and Asian region, the excavation of variety of ornamental objects made of lapis lazuli, which was mined only at a few places in northeast Afghanistan and South Pakistan, provides evidence to trade between the two regions. Further, archaeological evidence in the form of Indian red clay potteries, which was made in Gujarat, found in the northern coast of Oman, and in the ancient port city of Sohar, which is now called Sohar, exists. In 5th century BCE, Darius I, the Persian king of Achaemenid Empire, extended his territory from Persia to Kathiawar region. He was the first ever foreign imperial power to rule over parts of India. Obviously, there would have been trade and cultural connection across the entire kingdom. Then we have the documentary evidence in the form of Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is believed to have been written in the 1st century of Common Era. This book is equivalent to modern day sailing directions that naval officers will be familiar with and refers to trade between Rome and India, sailing along the Red Sea. It specifically mentions the trade taking place between Barigaza, which is present-day Bharuch, and Muziris, which is near the present-day Kochi, with Egyptian port of Mosul. With the advent of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE, the shipbuilding as well as the maritime trade started shifting first in the favor of Persian and then to Arabs. By the end of the first millennium, the shipborne trade had largely shifted from Indians to the hands of Arab traders, where it remained till the arrival of Europeans. This transition was primarily driven by commercial, religious, and cultural ambition, which did not disturb the maritime exchanges progressing unhindered between the west coast of India and West Asia. Now I'll touch upon the maritime culture of the Gulf of Kutch. Salaya can be considered as the Mecca of maritime trade since the 17th century CE due to the sheer spread of activities related to it, be it dhow construction or the crew required to sail on them, or the interconnection with the hinterland of Malwa region, which was famous for its high quality of cotton. The fabric made out of Malwa cotton was exported from Mandvi harbor, which was a major trading port at the mouth of Gulf of Kutch, before it was abandoned due to excessive siltation. One of the remarkable features of the development of seafaring in Kutch was the royal patronage. During the reign of Jadeja rulers like Rao Godji, Rao Deshalji, and Rao Lakhpatji in the 18th century, the technical and engineering expertise of shipbuilding was acquired from the Netherlands to further the shipbuilding activities in Kutch. It is here on the banks of river Rukmavati and its estuary that the largest number of dhows were being built and are still being built, even though their numbers are dwindling at an alarming rate. There are principally two communities that are intimately connected to shipping: the Bhatala community, who are Sunni Muslims, and the Kharwas, who are Hindus. Both these Kutchi communities have been involved in the shipping as well as the shipbuilding business for more than a century now. The dhows built by them are called as Vahans in the local language, which translates as means of transport. In the present times, the shipbuilding and sailing crew are predominantly Muslims that come from Bhatala community. The shore business is now dominated by Hindus of Kharwa communities and by Jains. The young men of the region, having grown up hearing the stories of rags to riches by a few seamen from their community who learned the ropes of seamanship on board dhows of Salaya and subsequently worked in Dubai and other ports of the Gulf, they returned every year with large sums of money to marry, to build large houses and places of worship, and to retire comfortably in due course. The locals from other communities, however, hold the view that most Novarishu of both the communities have acquired their ill-gotten wealth by indulging in smuggling activities on board dhows while operating out of Dubai. In 1970s and 1980s, prior to opening up of Indian economy in 1991, the import duty on foreign goods, especially the luxury goods, was so high that a full-fledged and well-oiled smuggling system existed, wherein gold, silver, electronic goods, watches, perfumes, cigarettes, and alcohol were frequently smuggled in India. Dhows from Gujarat were alleged to be involved in this trade. A typical Bhatala teenager trying to fulfill his Dubai dream joins a shipyard in Salaya as an apprentice, where a dhow is being built. If he is found worthy of it, he will eventually be taken as a crew and sail in the same dhow. If not found suitable, he would work in other shipping related jobs on shore till another opportunity comes his way to join a dhow. The other communities, that is Kharwas, have traditionally been serving under the Hindu states of Bhatiyas and Lohana communities of Kutch. As Bhatiyas and Lohanas progressively moved out of shipping business in the last century or so, Kharwas also moved over to other businesses run by their masters in India and abroad. Running shops and factories by these businessmen communities with loyal Kharwa workers having old family ties became an alternative to operating at sea. While there has been a change in the nature of employment, the Kharwa community continues to follow the old custom of returning to Mandvi from the Gulf during every monsoon, just like old times when their dhows used to be laid off due to bad weather to perform various family rituals like weddings, annual pilgrimages, and other religious ceremonies. Let us have a look at the current mode of operation of Indian dhows. It would be interesting to know how the ancient dhow trade is being conducted in the modern times. An average Indian dhow is built on the coast of Salaya in the port towns of Porbandar, Viraval, or Bedi, which is in Jamnagar. The tonnage varies from 500 to 1700, but usually it is 600 to 700 tons. It is driven by an engine or a single sail and moves at a slow speed of 5 to 7 knots. There are about 300 Gujarat registered dhows and approximately 10,000 or lesser personnel employed in this business. The normal modus operandi is that once they are built in one of the ports of Salaya, these dhows are registered as mechanized sailing vessels or MSVs, which are primarily supposed to be propelled by wind power. This is done to take advantage of the low cost of registration charged by Indian government in case of traditional sailing vessels. In addition, they are fitted with a small propulsion plant, which is generally a second-hand diesel engine from Alang shipbreaking yard, to help in auxiliary propulsion. However, once the dhow is registered in India, it is sailed to foreign destinations in Persian Gulf, usually Dubai or Sharjah. Here, the small propulsion plant is replaced with a new engine of a higher capacity, and the hull is suitably strengthened to carry a larger quantity of cargo. Now, the dhow becomes a proper motorized vessel, capable of carrying a much larger quantity of cargo to a greater distance and at a faster speed. This is where the vessel moves from the normal to gray zone in terms of its registration documents. Generally, there is a businessman from the Gulf region involved in providing support during this modification. He, along with the original Indian owner, becomes the joint owner of the vessel and profits from the income generated by it plying as a motor vessel while still enjoying the concessions and reduced tariff applicable to sailing vessels. Thereafter, a dhow with its Gujarati crew sails in and out of the Persian Gulf, usually going to Somalia, Yemen, and Oman. Despite several incidents of hijacking by Somali pirates and a ban imposed by the DG Shipping on them, these dhows continue to operate in the high-risk areas of Somalia, seeking means of livelihood and sometimes in search of higher profits. In the recent past, the turmoil in Iran, Iraq, Somalia, and Yemen has had involvement of extra-regional powers like USA and the European Union, who imposed various sanctions on these countries under the UN and other resolutions. Under these sanctions, the life of common people of these countries has been adversely affected, as many of the items which are considered of dual usage, that is military and civil purpose, are not allowed to be imported. In addition, in case their airports and major ports are closed down due to military action, no supplies would reach these beleaguered people. In such case, Indian dhows, driven by the motive of quick profit and lack of alternative means of livelihood in India, would do coasting and enter a minor port to deliver the much needed cargo. Sometimes they would intermingle with the local fishing traffic to avoid detection by security agencies, especially if they were carrying contraband or dual use cargo. In such cases, the freight charges would be much higher and would result in extra profit to the dhow owners and the crew. These dhows, therefore, have almost become an indispensable logistic provider to the common population of such countries. Since the first Gulf War, Indian dhows have continued to operate between Kutch and West Asia and further to the east coast of Africa till date. The latest addition in their list of ports of call are from Yemen. To conclude, the maritime connectivity between Kutch and the Persian Gulf, lasting over 5 millennia, has risen, fallen, and risen several times, like the rising and falling tides of the waters of the Indian Ocean that washes their shores. The dhows and the seamen who sailed on them were the ambassadors of exchange of not just the trade, but also of people, idea, culture, religion, food, music, and history. They were ably supported by several communities like the shipbuilders, traders, religious preachers, and the rulers. In the 19th century, when the steam and iron ships nearly killed the sailing ship industry of Kutch, the export of low volume commodities and foodstuff like salt, onion, watermelon, and mangoes to the Arabian Peninsula helped Indian dhows to survive. On return voyage, these dhows loaded dates and sold them in the markets of Mumbai before returning home to Kutch. When the opportunity to go to sea started getting unattractive for the Kutchi sailors and traders, they opened businesses in the Gulf region and many of them have flourished there. Mr. Kanaksi Khimji of the famous Khimji Ramdas Group, who has recently been conferred the title of Sheikh by the Sultan of Oman in recognition of his service to that country, epitomizes the human connection of Kutch with the Persian Gulf. After World War II, when the cargo for sailing ships started dwindling, the Dubai trade of the 1970s, even though controversial, helped in reviving Indian dhows. When the trade sanctioned by the UN started interfering in the day-to-day lives of the ordinary people of the Persian Gulf in 1990s, Indian dhows came to their rescue. Now, when the dhow building is once again dying, there have been several cases of rich sheikhs of the Gulf ordering custom-built dhows from the shipbuilders of Salaya, which has helped the culture of dhow building to survive for some more time. Hence, the ancient connection between the Gulf of Kutch and the Persian Gulf has managed to survive and sustain through the ups and downs, albeit with the same quietness that has characterized their relationship for several centuries. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much. Let me now call upon Commodore Sanjay D. Kunha to present his paper, The Cultural Civilizational Impact on Chinese and Indian New Regionalism in the Indian Ocean. Over to you, Commodore D. Kunha.
Admiral Abhay Karve, senior officers, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure for me to present a paper at the maiden National Maritime History Conclave being conducted by the Maritime History Society. India and China are the two civilizational powers in Asia that have emerged as pivotal states in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Their civilizational greatness, harking back to over 5,000 years, has always been the focus and the basis on which these two countries have sought a privileged position. These countries were also the predominant economies in the pre-colonial period. China is tryst with the Indian Ocean, and India's tryst with the East Pacific has been historic, with memories of voyages, trade, and people movement in the ancient period. The Chola maritime voyages of trade and conquest are the early manifestations of ancient regionalism evidenced by India. This trade and commerce resulted in extensive cultural exchanges with Southeast Asia and even beyond the Strait of Malacca. Similarly, the Ming dynasty of China established trading routes and naval voyages with the island states of the Indian Ocean, including Ceylon, Seychelles, and Madagascar, right up to the East African coast. Ancient China had a rich trading and cultural connect with these regions. The historic naval expeditions by Admiral Zheng He and his formidable fleet gave China the possibility to reach all Southeast Asian countries, the Indian subcontinent, and the coast of Africa. The advent of European imperialism witnessed the rapid decline of both China and India. However, in the post-colonial period, both countries have come a full circle and have been able to position themselves in terms of economic rise, cultural and civilizational renaissance, and the attendant derivatives of science and technology. The new regionalism approach envisages for the Asian powers of India and China the potential of rediscovery of the ancient civilizational and cultural icons of trade, connectivity, and maritime power. New regionalism, in its innate dynamics, has seen China and India shape the Asia Pacific economic and security architecture. This energy of a new manifest destiny for the two Asian powers emerges from the civilizational cultural context of India and China. In this talk, I will therefore dwell on the cultural civilizational impact on Chinese and Indian new regionalism in the Indian Ocean, and take it back to prehistoric times and how these two countries have been using this ancient connect to influence geopolitics in the region. Starting first with the rise of China, with the rise of India. India overthrew the colonial yoke and gained independence in August 1947. Jawaharlal Nehru, who took over as the first Prime Minister of India, was faced with a myriad of challenges. These included, above all, the scars of partition, integrating a host of independent princely states. Then there was the first Indo-Pak War of 1947-48. There was bitter rivalry between India and Pakistan, which cast a shadow over India's ability to attain the heights that she had attained during the pre colonial period, when India was a dominant and rich civilization that was respected around the world. So, although foreign policy took a backseat, the political leadership under Nehru placed India's Asian identity and relations with East and Southeast Asia at the center stage of India's relations with the world, however limited that may have been. This was evident from the first Asian conference that was held in 1947 in New Delhi, and then the Bandung conference in 1955, when Nehru sought to define a new post colonial relationship between these countries. Yet, the politics of the Cold War, on the one hand, and India's own inward looking model of industrial development weakened her interface with much of Asia. The reduced emphasis on trade and economic engagement saw the erosion of India's physical connectivity as well as her ancient maritime links for which she was so well known. In effect, Nehruvian strategic doctrine contributed to a virtual absence of any strategic relationship between India and the outside world. But things changed with the end of the Cold War, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a turning point for India. It was also at about the same time that Narasimha Rao came with the Look East policy in 1991, which heralded new relationships with ASEAN and East Asian countries. At the same time, India began to tilt more towards the United States. But it was clear that India sought a path of strategic autonomy. And if you look back at India's history right from independence, even with her relationship with the third world countries and the non alignment movement, which India championed at that time, India always sought to be beholden to no one, but follow an independent foreign policy. Also, India would rather see a multipolar world replacing the Cold War era, in which India would play a strategic role rather than be a junior partner in any US alliance system. So, this, as I said, is an essential characteristic of India's strategic culture, that of a proud nation with a civilizational greatness that will not allow her to bow to anyone, because she has the inherent belief that she will attain her manifest destiny as a natural progression of the rising indices of power that she has begun to possess. Come 2014, and we have the rise of the nationalist government under Narendra Modi. And this has again been another significant change in India's trajectory. The seeds were already sown with the earlier government, but it has been taken to a new level. And Modi has given focus to the Look East policy through the Act East initiative, which gives an action orientation to the same policy and signifies the greater importance that India gives to Southeast Asia and to East Asia. Most importantly, and this I think is the crux, India has once again begun to go back to the seas. To the seas and to the traditional maritime preponderance that she enjoyed right through her history. When India was respected across the Indian Ocean and beyond for a great civilization, cultural superiority, and soft power. This facet is all the more significant because the country has finally sought to overcome the traditional colonial continental mindset which had resulted in her neglect of the seas. Since times immemorial, India has been a maritime power. It is this maritime power that gave her respect and status across the Indian Ocean states. When India chose to neglect the seas, she lost not just her civilizational connect, but also her very independence. In seeking to reverse this sea blindness, the Modi government has sought to emphasize closer cooperation with the region. And by coining the new acronym SAGAR, which means safety and growth for all in the region, it is indicative of the greater significance that India accords to the seas, and at the same time to indicate to them that we do not harbor any hegemonistic designs in the region. The launch of Project Mosam in 2014 at the UNESCO World Heritage Committee meeting, which was held in Doha, is another very significant Indian venture. It was initially projected as an initiative so that India would get a claim in the World Heritage Committee list. But recognizing the significance of it and the way we could use our ancient civilization to connect across the region was the primary focus for which Project Mosam has been given the due importance. The launch of Project Mosam in the year 2014 was probably the most significant impact in India's vision of reaching out to the region. It was initially envisaged as an initiative by which India would connect with these regions and showcase her ancient connect with the region. It has come out as a full-fledged project where India is seeking to recreate the ancient civilization connect across the region, when the Indian Ocean span right from the Arab world in the western regions to right up to Southeast Asia at the eastern fringes, with the Indian subcontinent straddling the region, was the key focus. By harking back to ancient times, India is seeking to once again establish these influential connects through ideology, people to people contact, and interactions which are aimed at common prosperity. Having seen the Indian initiative, we now go on to the rise of China and how China is now positioning herself and projecting herself as a leading power, not just in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, or Southeast Asia, but right into the Indian Ocean. In the post-Cold War period, China sought to consolidate her national power through an emphasis on resurrecting her nationalism at the state, societal, and ideological levels, largely through the CPC, the Chinese Communist Party. But by the time of the global financial crisis of 2008, it was a defining moment because China finally arrived as a new great power in international politics, to coincide also with the relative decline of the US in the post 2008 financial crisis period. China's economy has grown continuously since then, but at this time, China also began flexing her military capabilities in unrecognizable ways. China was well on the way to acquiring the ability to dominate its periphery and project power where it had not operated before. So even as most of the countries, especially Southeast Asia, began to get suspicious of China's growing rise and influence abroad, China sought to quell any suspicions by perpetuating the thought that its rise was a natural progression of a growing economic progress, but which was attributable to an ancient civilizational strength rather than just being a national phenomenon. So what China is trying to project is again harking back as India did to her ancient civilizational roots, so did China. And in highlighting her ancient civilizational roots, she's trying to position herself or rather create a new post-modern order. If you look at the modern order, that is defined by the present Westphalian system or Western capitalism. The Chinese are now trying to seek their traditional value system, and which is tinted with Chinese socialism, and project it as the modern and the future for most of the region. So China's choice has therefore been to weave a new framework with new discursive terms such as civilization, what they call Wenming, or Wang Dao, which is Kingly Way, or Tiansha, And Tian Sha is the most important because it talks of all under heaven. All under heaven, essentially with China being the predominant power in this new system. And in this system, China seeks to replace the traditional order with the tribute investiture system, civilizational state, empire state, and all under heaven into the realm of contemporary international politics. There is no better initiative than this, or rather better evidence than this, than the measures taken by Xi Jinping through the Belt and Road Initiative, a signature initiative that takes the course of revival and links it to the ancient concept of the Silk Road. Xi Jinping has sought to bring about important shifts in the social, economic, and political dynamics of contemporary globalization by conceptualizing the Silk Road as a geo-cultural construct, a romanticized grand narrative of pre-modern globalization in which exchange, trade, and cross-cultural encounters have come to be associated with discourses of peace, international harmony, and dialogue. The Belt and Road Initiative consists of two parts. The first, the Silk Road Economic Belt, with its continental route, seeks to establish Chinese primacy in the Eurasian heartland, while the Maritime Silk Road traces the maritime route from the South China Sea through the Strait of Malacca, the entire Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and into the Mediterranean Sea. China has traditionally been a continental power with a landward focus that has extended into the Eurasian heartland. In the maritime dimension, there was relatively limited connect. There was some trade with Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean during the period of the Song dynasty, but the movement of Chinese vessels into the Indian Ocean was relatively limited. In the current geopolitical scenario, China has realized that her interests lie at sea, both with her immediate concern in the South China Sea and also extending into the Indian Ocean, where her main sea lines of communication exist. With the formidable presence of the United States, China recognizes that the maritime dimension is too significant to ignore. Further, India, located at the very center of the Indian Ocean, poses a continuous challenge to her economic well being, which is linked to the trade routes through the Indian Ocean. The Maritime Silk Road is therefore the critical element in Chinese policy that seeks to nullify the relative vulnerability that China possesses presently in the Indian Ocean. China has sought to justify her renewed ties with the Indian Ocean states as a relic of her maritime history. But it is interesting to note that China's limited ingress into the Indian Ocean was a main focus of, or rather, it was a known fact of her history. And it was only during the 15th century that the Ming Dynasty and Admiral Zheng He made forays into the Indian Ocean with notable success. In fact, even the voyages of Zheng He, who himself was a Muslim or eunuch, and his crew were largely non-Chinese and probably drawn from coastal regions such as even Fujian Arabs. But the accounts of the Zheng He voyages, which the Xi Jinping administration seeks to use to spread the popular perception that the voyages were friendly diplomatic activities, probably were not really entirely friendly and diplomatic. The official narrative says that the Maritime Silk Road just seeks to emulate those voyages when when Zheng He demanded that locals should kowtow to the scrolls of heaven on the Chinese emperor. In effect, the perception perpetuated by the Chinese is quite different from reality. The position of military interventions by Zheng He in South and Southeast Asia is supported by various historians, including Tan Sen Sen, who argues that the Chinese wanted, even at that time, to exert military power in South Asia and legitimize the usurpation at the Ming court. Whatever be the actual facts, and I don't want to get into history, it is important to note that the Chinese have sought to portray the image of China as a seafaring nation that had deep cultural roots with Southeast Asia and, more importantly, with the Indian Ocean states through the maritime route. China has thus reappropriated the maritime route in the Indian Ocean as a legacy of its ancient civilizational cultural connect and the basis for its 21st century maritime Silk Road. So, in summation, therefore, the 21st century has witnessed the rise of the two of Asia, namely India and China, both having all the indices of great power status and an ancient civilization that spans over centuries. As with all great powers, both nations seek to expand their influence over the countries of the region. In a defining and enduring characteristic of 21st century geostrategic relations, as enunciated in the new regionalism approaches of India and China, these countries are seeking to utilize their ancient ties and civilizational greatness to re-establish a connect across the region. The Belt and Road Initiative of China is a clear ideation of the cultural, civilizational, economic greatness that China seeks to leverage in expanding its sphere of influence. In this Confucian model, China projects itself as the center of the world and a tributary system that extends outwards, by which all nations eventually acknowledge the superior civilization of China. The Belt and Road Initiative follows this model under the same Confucian concept that does not seek domination, but to ensure that all nations rise economically whilst being carefully circumscribed under the benign gaze of China. Sucked in as India is, with the growing Chinese maritime presence in our immediate neighborhood and the constant and direct threat from China on its northern land borders, India has little option but to bolster her capabilities in the Indian Ocean, which has been her backyard since the ancient civilizational connect of the Harappan era. This is also in keeping with her growing international stature and her ambition of bringing the preponderant power in the Indian Ocean. The ancient civilizational connect and cultural soft power with the entire maritime space of the Indian Ocean extending to the African coast, the Red Sea, and the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations in the west, to Southeast Asia, Indochina, and up to China itself in the east, is a powerful ideational construct that India seeks to leverage to her own advantage. Project Mawsum has met with little success, not because of lack of its appeal, but because it has not been properly funded or supported by a whole of country approach that seeks to advance its aims, like the Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping presently does. Yet, Project Mawsum has a nascent advantage in that it is backed by historical evidence that is recognized without reservation across the region, and this probably is the most important fact. Vis-a-vis the aggressive drive by the Chinese dragon, the Indian elephant, in its slow but unobtrusive way, has provided an alternate ideational image of a country that seeks security and growth for all in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commodore Dikunha. Let me now call upon Aishwarya to present her paper, which is titled India, Africa and the Indian Ocean, Reviewing Interconnections with Special Reference to Siddhis of Janjira in an Archaeological Perspective. Aishwarya, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, good afternoon to one and all. It's my privilege to be here present today in National Maritime Heritage Conclave. So, next slide, please. Yeah. So, this is just an overview of what are topics I'm going to cover. Next slide. not a new player in witnessing major historical happenings and creating heritage values, and our seas are a witness to some of the major happenings in past times. Indian Ocean has been a major means of communication of earliest long-distance navigation between the western and eastern parts of Asia, Africa, and often extending well up much to Europe for several millennia. It has witnessed extensive maritime trade, naval expeditions, and pilgrimages across its extensive network. Oceanic activity in the region, encouraged by the unique feature of monsoons, allowed the countries to have an active participation in maritime trade, thus creating a long history covering a period of about 5 millennia from the very dawn of the Indus Valley civilization. Thus, maritime history and heritage is a testimony of our strong connection and relationship with the sea. Ships traversing the Indian Ocean carried a valuable merchandise, skills, knowledge, culture, religions, ideas, inventions, artistic styles, philosophies, and social customs from one end to another. Next slide, please. So, Indo-African relations are one of the unsung yet very important segments, among others, to understand the factor of oceanic activity. The evidence of African trade in India dates back to more than 5,000 years before present. This can be surely understood from the antiquities unearthed at various Indus Valley sites. The Indus merchants reached as far as the Persian Gulf and Euphrates Tigris Valley. Terracotta models of gorilla and mummy and a variety of African wood found at Lothal suggest trade with East Africa and Egypt. So unless Lothal modelers had intimate knowledge of gorilla, the great detailing on the animal or the figure is a bit impossible. So another evidence of contact is provided by the name Sikotari Mata, which is associated with the sea goddess and ports of Gujarat. While some of the gamesmen from Lothal simulate those from Tomb of Queen of Hexpout, the etched and plain carnelian beads found in Egypt and Bahrain are products of the bead factory at Lothal. Next, please. So this human intercourse was greatly facilitated by the trade winds which blew from November to March from the northeast and carried dhows from Asia to the East African coast. From the May to September, the winds reversed themselves, blowing from the southwest, and so carried the dhows and flew back to Arabian Peninsula, India, and the Far East. For the 5 months that the wind blew east to west, later as the times passed, Indians, Arabs, and other Asians could reach several points of East Africa, from the Horn to present-day Mozambique and beyond, selling their goods, establishing contacts. So now we come to the point: who were the Siddhi? So the Siddhi, also known as the Siddhi or Shiddi or Siddhi, are an ethnic group descendants of the Bantu people belonging to East Africa. Next slide, please. So the first Siddhis are thought to have arrived in India in 628 AD at the Bharuch fort. Several others followed with the first Arab Islamic conquest in 712 AD. The group are believed to have been soldiers with Muhammad bin Qasim's Arab army and were called Jhangi. In year 1296 CE, Konkan region came under the control of Delhi Sultanate, which in 1347 CE passed into the hands of Alauddin Bahman Shah, who laid the foundation of Bahmani kingdom. The Deccan rulers stabilized their rule, taking support of local Deccanis and the foreigners who were migrants from Africa, especially Ethiopia, to the Abyssinia. Most of them came here as the merchants, nobles, and ambassadors. Next slide. Malik Amba was one such noble who raised to a high position by becoming the kingmaker of Ahmednagar. He successfully checked the Mughal advance in Deccan and made alliance with the Abyssinian sailor turned noble called Siddhi and installed them as the rulers of Murud Janjira. Though the most Habsis came to India as slaves, their faithfulness, courage, and energy often raised them to high positions, trust in Bahmani court. According to Orning, successful Abyssinians gathered around them all of their countrymen, whom they could procure either by purchase or invitation including Negroes from other parts of Africa as well as Abyssinia. So, as rulers, city planners, and architects, Siddhis have left an impressive historical and architectural legacy that attests to their determination, skills, and intellectual, cultural, military, and political style. The imposing forts, mosques, and mausoleums, and the other edifices they built, some more than 500 years ago, still grace the Indian landscape. So our first such architectural marvel is Fort Janjira. Next slide. The first named Janjira or Janjira-e-Mehru, where Mehru meaning recent moon. The fort was built in 17th century. As per the inscription, the construction of the fort was commenced in year 1694 AD, and it was completed by Siddhi Sirul Khan in 1770. According to all accounts, the sea fort of Janjira could not be conquered by any of the kings ruling the neighboring territory. Surprisingly, even Shivaji Maharaj couldn't acquire it despite of 13 expeditions to conquer the fort. And this data is available from other Maratha chronicles as well. His son Sambhaji Maharaj tried a unique approach to capture the fort, digging an underwater tunnel to enter. But he too failed in his attempt. Not to be deterred, Sambhaji Maharaj constructed another fort across the bay called the Kansa Fort. So the Janjira Fort is built on an island which is oval in shape at the mouth of Muru Creek. So Muru Janjira Fort is situated on an oval-shaped rock of Arabian Sea coast, 165 kilometers south of Mumbai. The walls are said to be cemented with limestone, sand, salt, and jaggery. The ramparts and bastions are well preserved, and the fort is considered as one of the most strongest forts in Konkan Coast. Next slide. The fort wall is about 40 feet high, and inside the fort walls are the ruins of mosque, a palace, and a bath with water channels from streams. A deep well, still functional, provides the fresh water despite the fort being surrounded by salt water, saline water. So the fort houses Peer Panchayatan. So as one enters the main entrance and walks ahead, another door of the left is seen, and it is the Peer Panchayatan where there are 5 pairs in this room. A few graves can be seen in front yard. Then other few structures are horse stable, Sirul Khan's palace. So the Sirul Khan's palace is the most magnificent structure here. It is a 3-storied rectangular dilapidated structure, yet the grandeur can be seen. And since Siddhi Sirul Khan was the most well-known Siddhi of Janjira state, the structure is very important. The citadel is a square. It has a square for flag hosting and a royal courtyard behind the citadel. And Western Darwaza is also known as the Chor Darwaza, which gives an entrance to the sea for secret exit. The fort is truly impregnable, and no ruler was able to capture it, unlike other forts. The main entrance has, so this is the Siddhi, the important feature of Siddhi, that the main entrance has a stone carving depicting 6 elephants trapped by a single tiger, which is a symbol of bravery of Siddhi, the Siddhi philosophy of might. On the other side, there are 2 tuskers fighting with each other and 2 lions looking at them. It is said that during the time when Siddhis of Janjira ruled the fort, total 572 cannons were present, and today there are just 75. So the whole effort for talking about Fort Janjira is the grandeur which it possesses, and it is very important to highlight the Fort Janjira with respect to the Siddhi's affiliation to it. So the next slide, I talk about the site is Khopri Gumbaz. Next slide, please. Yeah. So while the Siddhi-controlled fort at Janjira has been recognized as a fine example of military fortification, the set of tombs at Khopri on the mainland across from Janjira has largely been excluded from the narrative of Siddhi architecture. At least 4 tombs are there on site, the largest being that of Siddhi Sirul Khan. The 2 smaller tombs are those of Harriet Khan and Yaqut Khan, brothers who preceded the Siddhi Sirul Khan. And the 4th tomb is unattributed. The site, which is officially, it includes 3 tombs, has been declared to be national importance site by Archaeological Survey of India, yet there is a little scholarship on it and thus possesses a lot of scope for study. So the site at Khopri is only 1.5 kilometers due east from the town of Rajapuri and has several baobab trees. A baobab meaning the Adansonia digitata trees, a reminder of African connection with cities. The three tombs of Siddhi Sirur Khan, Siddhi Yaqut, and Khairiyat Khan are set on high terrace platforms on the western side of the road that lead to the village of Kharamuli. The two tombs of Khairiyat Khan and Siddhi Yaqut are on double terrace platforms and most unusually face each other. The entrances to the tombs are therefore opposite each other across a small paved area, facing the cardinal directions of west and east respectively. The west in the Deccan being an approximate direction indicating the Qibla, the direction of prayer towards Mecca. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, octagonal cantonment pilasters are on all corners of the tomb. The pedestal of these pilasters is in form of large pots which from which octagonal column shaft emerges surrounded by petals. So columns with pedestals shaped like large earthenware pots are common across all Buddhist caves in and around Zanjira. Uh, yeah. So the petals around the shaft are reminiscent of Egyptian pyramids that usually appear close to capitals as well. So this is again one more connection or assimilation of Indian and African tradition. So commissioned by the Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah II, the Bijapur tomb is said to be the influence or the topic of influence from where Siddhi Sirur Khan adopted it. While completing the relatively modest tombs of his mentors, Sirur Khan made himself such an enormous funerary as an embodiment of his absolute power, relatively peaceful reign, and territorial expansion. The scheme of ornamentation was unique and more than a result of various cultural forces which cities encountered. Next slide. So now we will talk about Fort Underi. So I won't talk into much detail about Fort Underi as we have already looked into Fort Janjira, which is very magnificent. Yet this fort was a very important island fort in order to understand northward expansion of cities towards Mumbai and their efforts to consolidate sea power, keep check on Marathas and Portuguese and British as well. Next slide. We also have evidence of Mint house in Janjira fort, and the silver Ankushi rupee was stuck in the name of Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, minted under the dominance of Siddhis of Janjira. The coin was issued when Siddhi Ibrahim Khan II was the ruler of Janjira. He died. He was the Nawab of Janjira from 1789 to 1794, and he died in 1826. So this is one more very interesting find when it comes to archaeological evidences. Next slide, please. So Afro-Indians called Siddhis possess a rich cultural heritage which extends back several centuries to the region of Ethiopia. Entering India in the capacity of traders and achieving recognition in administrative and military positions in the vicinity, the Siddhis soon took charge of the fortress of Janjira, indirectly keeping state sway over the Konkan, which lay on the west coast of India, and used the sea power as the seat of government. It is very interesting to note that today the African community in India is well assimilated into local population, and small communities of Siddhis live in parts of Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Goa, and Hyderabad. The descendants of these African rulers intermarried with other Indian communities and thus slowly lost their identity. Today, there are around 50,000 people of African descent in India, and most of them descendants of Africans who came here centuries ago. They speak local Indian languages, wear traditional Indian clothes, and follow local dietary practices. One can only recognize them through their physical appearance. One of the few remnants of their African past is their music and dance. Thus, cities of Janjira are living examples of maritime connectivity with its great potential and sound scope when it comes to domain of maritime researches or studies in maritime history and heritage with respect to both tangible and its intangible aspects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aishwarya. Okay. So over to you.
I'm quite fine. I'm actually going to bring up all the panelists. While we have been discussing a range of papers, Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam has expressed apologies for a bad day of Wi-Fi, which is probably an increasing frequency nowadays. We have bad days and worse days, but we are very grateful for those who had. We even had a break when Sanjay was speaking, so that part we are fine. I'm very encouraged by not just the papers, which have covered a very broad sweep across what Commodore Agarwal was talking about, DAOs, which covers a very wide period. Commodore Dakuna has taken it to current context. And our own in-house researcher, Aishwarya, has been working very hard for the last couple of months to just pick out these features of the cities, or what we call the India and Africa connection. What I intend doing is, I have seen the comments which have come on the private chat and on the YouTube, and I've tried to collate these and I'll pass it to each of the speakers. So let me come to Ajay. One interesting part is, we are aware you have been working very hard on the DAOs and the Gulf to Gulf connection, we call. So in that sense, there are a couple of questions, but I'll summarize this to say, is there something we find more on the transition to the Latin sales? If we bring DAOs and give them a heritage tag, like they talk of cultural tag to language, will that actually bring the whole boat building and DAO back into the focus? And reviving the entire DAO heritage, how will it build our own maritime power? So probably you could capture. They are different questions. I just tried to put it together. So Ajay, your response.
Thank you for the question. Let me just say that yes, Latin sales was considered to be the primary feature for identifying a DAO in the 18th century. But it's not exactly, we can say that Latin sale is across the board, it's the same sale all over. Why I'm saying that? Because there is a Sati sale also, which is a mix of square sale as well as the triangular sale, in which case the forend is cut short. So what has happened is, in case of house or in case of these country craft, if we can call them that, they are not fixed in the construction part. One design went from one shipyard to another shipyard because there was isolation. Probably there was no exchange of inputs on this. So another design got built while the name was retained, like Batelas, Kotias, Thonis, all these names which are given. Very interestingly, there is no uniformity per se. Second part that we have a problem is that we do not have a very detailed records of actually seeing how the progression happened. Now, if you see the excavation kind of a thing, you can see the images which are there in Ajanta. Most of the time, it is interesting to note that Indian boats have been shown with the mast, but without furling their sails. So we really don't know, except for some of the places in the Southeast Asia. In Borobudur, I've seen one image where all the sails have been deployed. So we really don't know exactly how the sails have evolved. But as I said, that Sati sail as well as the Latin sail, both are very much part and parcel of the Dhau trade, sailing sales features. Second part that you talked about is the cultural tag. Yeah, that's a very important one. In fact, Oman has taken a lead in this. where a couple of years back there was a sailing in one of the dhows, Indian-built dhows, coming from Oman to India. In fact, she came to Mumbai also. There is in Dubai there is a cruise on dhows. So what has happened is those places they have gone about institutionalizing dhows as part of their culture. There are Dhow museum in Oman. I have seen myself a museum where dhows have been preserved in a very good way in Salalah. So what I'm trying to say is that unfortunately, in case of India, we since it is still live, maybe that's the reason why we still haven't given them the status of making them as part of our history. But it's a living history. Actually, we should be looking at it as a living history, and it's the right time for us to start thinking in terms of collaborating with the Dhao builders to start as a medium of culture to do the sailings.
Thanks, Ajay, for that very broad sweep. What I'm going to do is, ideally, I should have come to Sanjay based on sequence, but Sanjay, I'll come back to you because you have some very interesting comments and questions line up. So let me go to Aishwarya. Aishwarya, from you've covered a lot of things from material culture and built heritage to bring the connectivity elements between the Abyssinians, the Siddhis, and the Indian coast. There was a comment from Admiral Nadkarni which said that a large number of Siddhis are also found in Uttara Kannada in Karnataka, and he did come across and them. And but there is a larger point. We know that they were there. We know they were here. Is there, from material evidence, something to talk about the maritime component of the connectivity? Any practices that come which talk about from the community practices, or are we still built on just interpretation of the material culture? What's your personal learning of the India-Africa connection through the maritime medium?
Well, so from what I know, yes, they still have a lot of intangible aspects of heritage. They have possessed, they have some kind of linguistic connection as well. So, to my knowledge, the linguistic affiliation or dance and music, these things need to be documented first. There are many scholars who are trying to document it from my studies. But still, what I find is if there are 50,000 plus people belonging to the cities, we have a lot of scope there.
Yeah, thanks, Aishwarya. And so I come to Commodore Sanjay Dakuna's very contemporary and a very diverse connectivity. You very highlighted the way India as a nation has evolved. So there were a couple of comments. I'm going to put both of them together. I won't go into the specifics, but I'm summarizing the comment. How has the political support to maritime connectivity? We won't get into specific whether it was 1960s, 1990s, 2014. I think in every decade there has been some initiative. How crucial is that political perspective or recognition of the maritime connectivity to building this maritime prowess or building this relationship? Today we have Sagar, but it's not that it was absent earlier. So that's question one. And a very specific part is the Vladivostok Chennai Maritime Corridor, the what was announced at the East Asia Summit. How does it enhance and does it bring security challenges? So one is more of the political support, and the second question is very specific on the Vladivostok Chennai Maritime Corridor. Your thoughts, Sanjay?
Right. Thank you, sir. I think the questions are absolutely relevant. The focus of my talk has been to bring out the cultural civilizational impact of Chinese and Indian new regionalism. What we are looking at is a way by which these countries are harking back to their ancient civilizations and using that as the basis of expanding their influence in the region. What we are seeing from the Chinese side is very, very direct. Very direct. The Belt and Road Initiative is one that even though they do not have as much of a civilizational connect, they are trying to hark back to Zengi voyages of the Ming dynasty and trying to show that it's benign and spread it all, not only to Southeast Asia, but right into the Indian Ocean and beyond. For India, India has actually had an even deeper maritime connect, right from the Harappan civilization days to the Sumerian civilizations, the Babylonians, and right into the Mahapajit kingdoms in Southeast Asia, whatever. But when you look at the immediate impact after our independence, we neglected. Firstly, it was a continental mindset which kept our focus in Delhi. But that was one part. The second part was that India just did not was so caught up within her own challenges, which I brought out. Whether it was India, Pakistan, the princely states, and then socialism, and then getting into the Soviet embrace in some ways, although not directly. But it prevented India from actually projecting outwards into the area where she was traditionally recognized. She was traditionally recognized as a great maritime civilization since times immemorial. And one may argue that it has been there in Indian subconsciousness. If you look back also, how many writings are there on India's maritime history or the importance that we need to give to our seas? And if there was in the it was just about, I think, K.M. Panikar who wrote very strongly about it. And it is now gaining predominance, uh, you know, over the past, I would say, 20 to 30 years. Primarily because India was a closed economy till 1991. It prevented us from actually interacting with most of the region. But after 1991, with the Look East initiative and now with the Act East initiative, we are actually reaching out not just to Southeast Asia, but right up to East Asia. Sagar and all these things may have been there incremental, but incrementally we were pursuing these things, but it wasn't given that sort of focus. But if you look after 1991 with the Lookies, and there was also the IONs, and these were all measures. India's participation in firstly involvement in ASEAN from 1992, where it was a sectoral partner, then 1995 when it became a full dialogue partner, then becoming part of the East Asia Summit, becoming part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, uh, and the BRICS. If you look at the AIIMB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, so these are all efforts by India to reach out to the larger community. But interestingly, India is trying to, like China is doing, India is trying to bring in that civilizational connect. And that civilization connect is very important, and it has actually gained emphasis only over the last 30 years, since 1991, and more so in the last with Project Mosam, which was launched in 2014. But as I said, Project Mosam is also slow to take off. It hasn't really taken off, largely because of various issues. But I think it needs focus from across the whole country. So that's. I hope that answers the first question, where we say that yes, it has been going on,
Thanks,
but it is,
thanks, Sanjay.
yeah.
Yeah, you did bring up what was asked silently about 1991, and we at the MHS in some of our own research, there are some papers that we have done. So we talk about the oceans in terms of culture, commerce, and connectivity. And in that sense, your geo-economic focus that you are bringing, it's not only contestations. Contestations have really not been seen. Looking at the time, I am going to draw this session to a close. Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam, before leaving, has left a set of comments, and I will ask Dr. Soni to read out those comments, and I'll just briefly respond, and then we will move towards the last session. So, Dr. Soni, if you could read out Professor Lakshmi's comments.
Great. Sure, sir. My pleasure. Um, Professor Subramaniam says, the three papers together emphasize the thematic continuity of the panel. Connections between India and the maritime world of the Western Indian Ocean are materialized in the three papers. One speaks of ships, actual carriers, the other of ideas of civilization and a sense of purpose by Asian countries, and the third about peoples who are unsung, even forgotten. Can we see the initiatives of the Navy as an important stakeholder in accessing real practices of people along the coast? So much has been lost in terms of material and ethnography, with reference to Badalas and Kharwas, for example. Can we see small initiatives to recover these voices? I believe that the Navy plays a key role in this sort of archive production, without which we cannot write our history. We will simply re-invoke old fragments and celebrate continuities and lament disruptions without really adding to the field. Finally, she says, she thinks the papers were terrific in foregrounding the three major vectors of connection: boats, ideas, and people. These were her comments.
Yeah, before I give it back to the conclave coordinator to conclude the session, I just want to add Professor Lakshmi. I'm very grateful she was there despite the connectivity issues. She is the one who introduced MHS to the idea, which we will see in the next year happen, the e-curating work. And that's been the inspiration behind our digital initiatives. And we will see by March an e-exhibition. But the larger point that she's left us with is education and awareness. So we have a team of people directly with MHS as full-time research associates, and then many more as adjunct. We are doing our bit, and we are going to expand this in a significant manner. As I have a trustees meeting tomorrow, with this, we sure will get that right support, and we have the support. The Navy has taken great initiative to see that awareness of maritime capability and initiative is taken beyond the practitioners, but made a part of common populace. So that's just to confirm what the moderator had said. So back to you, Dr. Soni, and to conclude the session and instructions, and we'll, without a break, thereafter move into the valedictory session. Over to you, Dr. Soni.
Thank you so much, sir. I thank Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam for sharing her comments as the moderator of the session, even with all the tech challenges. Thank you so much. Let me also thank Commodore Ajay Agarwal, Commodore Sanjay D. Kunha, and Aishwarya Devasthali for presenting their thought-provoking papers. Really, thank you to one and all. Now, as we get ready, as our esteemed dignitaries get ready for the special session, I have something interesting to share. Maritime History Society is known for its work on the research. We are glad to announce a new initiative called Sagar Bhav. Please check out our website to know more about it.